It was late October in 2017, just a few days before Halloween. The air was crisp, and the sky above the Blackwood Forest in northern Maine was a deep shade of black, pierced only by a sliver of moonlight. Sarah Myers, a 28-year-old freelance writer, had rented a small, isolated cabin for the week to finish her upcoming novel. She had heard about Blackwood Cabin from a friend, a perfect retreat, she was told, away from the distractions of the city. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was rustic but cozy, with a single bedroom, a fireplace that crackled softly, and an old wooden desk where Sarah planned to spend most of her nights typing away. When she arrived that afternoon, everything seemed fine. The caretaker, an older man named Mr. Callahan, handed her the keys and warned her about the spotty cell service. "You'll be fine," he said with a reassuring smile, though his voice carried a peculiar edge. "But if you hear anything strange at night, just stay inside." Sarah laughed it off, assuming he was just playing into the Halloween spirit. By 10 p.m., the cabin had grown eerily quiet. The only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves outside and the occasional hoot of an owl. Sarah was seated at the desk, her laptop glowing in the dimly lit room. She was writing a particularly tense scene when she heard it, a faint knocking sound. It came from somewhere outside. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The knock was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like someone tapping on the wooden walls. Knock, knock, knock. Her stomach tightened. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her flashlight and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The cold night air stung her cheeks as she shone the light around. The woods were silent, still. Nothing moved. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. Sarah lingered for a moment, then went back inside, locking the door behind her. She convinced herself it was just a branch tapping against the cabin in the wind. But as the night wore on, the knocks grew louder and closer. By midnight, the knocking wasn't just outside anymore. It came from within the walls. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart pounding. The sound moved erratically. One moment it was by the fireplace, the next near the window. Her mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. Just as she reached for her phone, she remembered Callahan's warning. If you hear anything strange at night, just stay inside. Then, the knocking stopped altogether. For a moment, Sarah felt relief. But then, the silence was replaced by a low, raspy whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible. Sarah, her blood ran cold. The whisper wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. She spun around, the beam of her flashlight darting across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, distorted by the flickering light of the fireplace. Her breathing quickened as the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Sarah, come closer." She backed up until she felt the cold, rough texture of the cabin wall against her back. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam flickering like her resolve. The voice was unmistakable now, low and guttural, reverberating through the small cabin as though it came from the very wood itself. "Come closer," it repeated, slower this time, almost taunting her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. Summoning every ounce of courage, She forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, all at once, the fire in the fireplace extinguished, plunging the room into near total darkness. The flashlight's weak glow was the only thing keeping her from being swallowed whole by the shadows. The knocking started again, but now it was frantic, loud, rapid, and relentless, coming from all directions at once. Knock, 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 knock. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, its walls trembling with a force that rattled the dishes in the kitchen and sent Sarah's laptop clattering to the floor. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Leave me alone." As suddenly as it started, the knocking ceased. The cabin was deathly silent again, but it wasn't comforting. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though something unseen was watching her, waiting. The whisper returned, closer now, right by her ear. "Don't turn around." Her blood turned to ice. She could feel something, a presence, standing behind her. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The room was suffocatingly still. The seconds stretched into an eternity before she heard it. The soft creak of the floorboards directly behind her, followed by the faintest inhale, like someone or something was breathing down her neck. Without thinking, she spun around, the flashlight swinging wildly. Its beam landed on nothing. The room was empty. Her chest heaved as she stumbled backward, tripping over the rug and crashing to the floor. The flashlight rolled out of her hand, its beam flickering out. And then she saw it. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, a figure began to materialize in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a dark, shapeless mass, but slowly, horrifyingly, it began to take form. Long, bony limbs unfolded from the shadow, its fingers impossibly long, curling like claws. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless, save for two hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sounded like nails on a chalkboard, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. She bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in her panic. The figure didn't move, but the walls began to groan and creak, as if they were closing in on her. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. Finally, the lock gave way, and she yanked the door open, sprinting into the cold night without looking back. The forest was eerily silent, save for the crunch of her boots on the fallen leaves. She didn't know where she was running, just that she had to get away. The cabin loomed behind her, its windows glowing faintly, like eyes watching her escape. But then, from the shadows of the trees, she heard it again. "Sarah." The whisper was no longer coming from the cabin. It was all around her, echoing through the forest. Sarah's lungs burned as she pushed herself deeper into the forest, weaving between the towering trees. Her flashlight was gone, and the moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above. Every shadow seemed alive. Every crack of a branch behind her sent fresh waves of terror coursing through her veins. "Sarah." The voice was relentless, closer now, slithering through the darkness like a predator. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It felt as though it was right in her head, as though it knew her every thought, her every fear. She tripped over a root, crashing to the ground with a cry. Dirt and dead leaves clung to her hands as she scrambled up, her knees shaking. She turned her head just enough to glance back at the path behind her, and froze. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the clearing. Its hollow, glowing eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, fingers curling into the ground like roots. Sarah didn't scream. She couldn't. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure took one slow, deliberate step forward. "Why are you running?" it rasped, its voice echoing through the trees. She stumbled backward, her legs barely carrying her as she turned and ran again. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around her like a maze. Her mind raced, desperate for a plan. She couldn't outrun it, whatever it was. Then she saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Her heart leapt. A light, faint but steady, filtering through the trees. It could be a house, she thought. Maybe someone who could help. With every ounce of strength left in her, she pushed herself toward the light, her footsteps uneven and frantic. As she broke through the tree line, she nearly collapsed with relief. There, in the center of a small clearing, stood an old wooden chapel. Its windows were illuminated by the faint glow of candlelight, and the heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar. The chapel looked ancient, its white paint peeling, the cross at the top bent and weathered. But it didn't matter. It was shelter. She rushed up the steps, glancing behind her one last time. The figure was gone. The forest was silent again, but she didn't trust it. Not for a second. Pushing the doors open, Sarah stepped inside, slamming them shut behind her. The smell of aged wood and wax greeted her as she leaned against the door, gasping for air. Rows of empty pews stretched before her, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. At the far end of the chapel stood an altar, and behind it, a statue of an angel. Its hands were clasped in prayer, its face serene, but something about it felt off. Sarah took a step forward, her boots echoing against the wooden floor. The silence was almost deafening. And then, as she approached the altar, she noticed something. The candles weren't melting. Their flames flickered, but the wax beneath them remained untouched, pristine. Before she could process the thought, the chapel door behind her rattled violently. Knock, 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 knock. Her breath caught as the banging grew louder, more insistent. She backed away, her eyes darting to the windows. The glowing eyes were there, staring at her from the darkness outside. "Sarah!" The voice came again, louder now, reverberating through the chapel. She turned toward the altar, desperate for a way out, for anything that could save her. But as her gaze fell on the angel statue, she realized it had changed. Its head was no longer bowed in prayer. It was tilted up, staring straight at her. Its lips parted. "You shouldn't have come here either," it whispered. Sarah staggered back, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The angel's eyes, lifeless stone just moments before, now gleamed with an unnatural light. Its whisper echoed in her ears, blending with the relentless knocking on the chapel door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deafening now, shaking the very walls of the chapel. The flickering candles cast wild, twisting shadows that seemed to dance and lurch closer to her. "Please, no," she stammered, her voice barely audible as she backed away from the altar. The angel's head tilted further, its expression shifting from serene to something darker, a grotesque smirk that stretched across its face. The once pristine marble now appeared cracked, the fissures glowing faintly with an eerie, pulsating light. Suddenly, the door behind her burst open with a deafening crash. Cold air swept into the chapel, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. "No," Sarah screamed, spinning around to face the door. The figure was there, its towering form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Its glowing eyes burned like twin embers, locking onto her as it stepped inside. "Stay away," she shouted, grabbing a candle holder from the nearest pew. She brandished it like a weapon, though her hands trembled so badly it was barely steady. The figure didn't stop. Its movements were slow, deliberate, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it advanced. The sound of its footsteps echoed unervingly in the empty space, each step louder than the last. Desperate, Sarah turned back toward the altar, hoping for some kind of escape, but the angel statue was gone. In its place was a dark, gaping void, a swirling mass of shadow and light that seemed to stretch into infinity. A low, guttural voice emanated from the void, layered and inhuman. "You've seen too much, Sarah. You can't leave." Tears streamed down her face as she stood frozen, trapped between the figure behind her and the impossible void before her. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her chest like a weight. She struggled to breathe, her vision swimming. Then she remembered the lighter in her pocket. With trembling hands, she pulled it out and flicked it on. The small flame wavered in the oppressive darkness, but it was enough to illuminate the shadowy figure. For the first time, Sarah saw its face, or what passed for one. It had no mouth, no nose, only those glowing, hollow eyes. Its skin was as black as the void behind the altar, shifting and writhing like smoke. "Stay back!" she screamed, waving the lighter at it. The figure recoiled slightly, its movements jerky, as though the flame pained it. Taking her chance, Sarah bolted toward the altar. The void pulsed, emitting a deafening hum that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. She didn't know why she was running toward it, only that it felt like the lesser of two evils. As she reached the edge of the swirling darkness, the voice spoke again, louder this time, shaking the walls of the chapel. "Choose." Her heart thundered in her chest. The void seemed to pull at her, beckoning her to step inside. Behind her, the figure let out an otherworldly screech, its long limbs reaching for her. Sarah hesitated for a split second before making her choice. With no time to think, and the figure's claws nearly brushing her back, Sarah made her choice. She stepped into the void. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. It was as though the world collapsed around her, folding in on itself. The air was sucked from her lungs, her vision distorted by blinding flashes of light and utter blackness. Her body felt weightless, tumbling endlessly through a space that had no up or down, no walls, no end. Then silence. She landed hard on a cold, stone surface. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, and for a moment she lay there, disoriented and gasping. The swirling chaos of the void was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a massive, circular chamber. The walls were made of ancient stone, etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air was cold, damp, and filled with a faint hum that seemed to resonate in her chest. In the center of the room stood a tall, ornate mirror, its surface rippling like liquid. It was the only source of light, casting long, flickering shadows across the chamber. "Where am I?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast emptiness. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. The room felt impossibly vast, stretching farther than her eyes could see, yet there was nowhere to go. The mirror seemed to call to her, its surface shimmering with an unnatural energy. As she approached it, the hum grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the soles of her feet. When she was just a few feet away, the mirror stilled, its surface becoming smooth and reflective. Sarah gasped. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. The figure in the mirror had her face, her features, but its eyes were pitch black, and its expression twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. "Sarah," the reflection said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "You're not me." The reflection tilted its head, studying her with an eerie calm. "I am everything you've hidden, every fear, every doubt, every shadow you've buried deep inside." "Get away from me," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She stumbled back, but the reflection stayed fixed, grinning wider. "You can't escape," it said, stepping closer to the glass. "This place is you, Sarah. Every corner, every shadow, it's yours. And now, so am I." The reflection pressed its hand against the surface of the mirror, and to Sarah's horror, the glass rippled again, this time outward. "No!" she screamed, turning to run, but the chamber stretched endlessly in all directions. The hum grew deafening, and the light from the mirror cast her shadow long and thin across the stone floor. She turned back, just in time to see the reflection step through the mirror, its body fluid and shifting like smoke. It was no longer just a reflection. It was real, and it was coming for her. The thing that had once been her reflection took its first step onto the cold stone floor, its movements fluid but unnatural, as if it didn't fully understand how a body worked. Its pitch-black eyes bore into Sarah, and its twisted smile widened as it spoke again, its voice a distorted echo of hers. "There's nowhere to run, Sarah. You brought me here." "No," Sarah whispered, backing away, her hands trembling. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "Oh, but it is," the figure said, taking another step forward. "You've hidden me for so long, but now I'm free. Do you know what that means?" Sarah shook her head, her back colliding with the rough stone wall. "It means," the figure continued, its voice soft yet chilling, "that I get to take everything." It raised a hand long, pale fingers stretching unnaturally, and the chamber began to change. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. The air grew heavy, pressing down on Sarah's chest. She clutched at her throat, struggling to breathe. The chamber wasn't just alive, it was feeding off her fear. Desperate, Sarah scanned the room for anything she could use to defend herself. Her eyes fell on the mirror, which still rippled faintly, its surface glowing. A thought struck her, wild and irrational. Maybe it's a way out. The figure noticed her gaze and laughed, a sound like glass shattering. "You think you can escape?" it sneered, stepping closer. You think the mirror will save you. It lunged, its movements impossibly fast, but Sarah reacted on instinct. She dove to the side, rolling across the cold stone floor. The figure's clawed hand slammed into the wall where she'd just been, sending cracks spidering through the ancient stone. Heart pounding, Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran toward the mirror. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to hum with energy, pulling at her like a magnet. "Stop!" the figure roared, its voice reverberating through the chamber. Sarah ignored it. She reached the mirror and hesitated for only a moment before pressing her hands against its surface. The glass felt warm, almost alive, and began to ripple under her touch. Behind her, the figure screamed a guttural, inhuman sound that shook the ground beneath her. "You can't leave," it howled, its footsteps pounding closer. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah threw herself into the mirror. The sensation was overwhelming, like being plunged into freezing water. Her body was weightless again, spinning through the void. But this time, she felt something pulling her forward, guiding her. Then, with a gasp, she was back. She found herself lying on the wooden floor of the cabin, her body drenched in sweat. The fire in the fireplace had gone out, and the room was dark, save for the faint glow of dawn creeping through the windows. For a moment, she thought it was over, but then she noticed something. The mirror from the chamber was there, leaning against the far wall. Its surface was smooth and reflective, but her reflection wasn't moving. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the mirror. Her reflection stood perfectly still, watching her, its twisted smile frozen in place. She scrambled back, her hands slipping on the cold wooden floor. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real. You're not me." The reflection tilted its head, mirroring her movements now, but its eyes remained dark, the smile never faltering. Slowly, it lifted a hand and pressed it against the glass. A faint sound, like nails scratching on a window, filled the room as cracks began to spiderweb across the mirror's surface. The glow in the room dimmed, and the air grew colder, heavier. Sarah forced herself to her feet, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out her thoughts. She needed to get out of the cabin. Whatever had followed her back, whatever this thing was, it wasn't staying trapped for long. She bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in her panic. Just as she yanked it open, she heard a low, guttural laugh from behind her. "Leaving already?" The voice sent chills down her spine. She turned just enough to see the mirror. The cracks had grown larger, glowing faintly, and her reflection was no longer behind the glass. It was stepping out. Its movements were fluid, almost too smooth, as it emerged from the fractured mirror, its form solidifying with every step. It was her, but darker, more twisted. Its features were sharper, its grin impossibly wide, and its black eyes seemed to pull in the light around them. "You can't escape me," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She ran out into the forest, the cold morning air biting at her skin. The sun was beginning to rise, but the light offered no comfort. The trees seemed darker, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, blocking the faint warmth of dawn. Behind her, she could hear it following. Its footsteps were unnervingly quiet, like it was toying with her, letting her think she could get away. "Sarah," it called, the voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. You can't run forever. She pushed herself harder, weaving between the trees, her lungs burning with every breath. Her mind raced, desperate for a plan, for anything that could stop this nightmare. And then, up ahead, she saw something, an old wooden bridge spanning a deep ravine. It looked ancient, barely held together by frayed ropes and rotting planks, but it was her only option. She sprinted toward it, the sound of her doppelganger's voice growing louder behind her. "Do you really think you'll get away?" it taunted. Reaching the bridge, Sarah hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the first plank. It creaked ominously under her weight, but she pressed on, gripping the ropes tightly as she moved. Halfway across, she risked a glance back. The thing that wore her face was standing at the edge of the bridge, watching her with those black, empty eyes. It tilted its head, its smile widening. "Go ahead," it said softly. "Run. But you can't leave me behind." To her horror, it stepped onto the bridge. The ropes groaned as it moved, the old wood cracking under its weight. Sarah turned and ran, the planks shifting beneath her feet. Just as she reached the other side, the bridge gave a violent lurch. She spun around in time to see her doppelganger standing in the middle, its grin still fixed in place. "You can't escape yourself," it said, its voice now layered with something deeper, more ancient. And then it jumped. The rope snapped, the bridge collapsing into the ravine with a deafening crash. Sarah fell back onto the ground, her chest heaving as she watched the pieces of wood tumble into the abyss. For a moment, there was silence. But then, from the depths of the ravine, she heard it again. "Sarah." Sarah's body trembled as she sat frozen on the edge of the ravine, her eyes fixed on the swirling darkness below. The echo of her name drifted up, faint but insistent, like a whisper carried on the wind. The forest was eerily quiet now, save for the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She forced herself to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stay here, not after what she'd seen. Turning away from the ravine, Sarah stumbled back into the forest, her mind racing. Her reflection, asterisk that thing asterisk, wasn't gone. It couldn't be. She could still feel its presence, like a shadow clinging to her. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. The path she thought she'd been following was gone, replaced by a maze of dense undergrowth and unfamiliar terrain. She walked for what felt like hours, the rising sun doing little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. The light was dim, muted, as though the forest itself refused to let it in. And then she saw it. Up ahead, through the trees, was another cabin. But this one was different. It looked almost identical to the one she had left, down to the weathered wood and broken shutters. But there was something off about it. The windows were dark, and the door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. Her stomach churned. She knew she should turn back, but something about the cabin drew her in, an unshakable pull she couldn't resist. As she approached, the air grew colder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath her weight, and peered inside. The interior was exactly like the first cabin, down to the fireplace, the furniture, and the mirror leaning against the far wall. Except this time, the mirror wasn't empty. Her reflection was there, staring back at her, its grin wider than ever. "Welcome back," it said, its voice dripping with malice. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding. "No, I left you behind. You're not real." The reflection laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small space. "You can't leave me, Sarah. Don't you see? I'm a part of you." The room began to shift, the walls closing in, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The reflection stepped out of the mirror once more, its form solidifying as it moved toward her. This time it didn't lunge. It simply stood there, watching her, its dark eyes boring into her soul. "I'm tired of playing games," it said. "You can't run from yourself. You'll never outrun me." Sarah's chest heaved as panic threatened to consume her. She backed away, her mind scrambling for a way out, for something, anything that could stop this. Her hand brushed against something cold and solid. She turned to see a rusted axe leaning against the wall. Her fingers closed around the handle, and she lifted it with trembling hands. The reflection's smile faltered for the first time. "Oh," it said, tilting its head. "You think you can fight me?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "But I have to try." The reflection took a step closer, its smile returning, wider than ever. "Go ahead," it said. "Let's see how far you'll go to destroy yourself." Sarah tightened her grip on the axe, her knuckles white, as her reflection took another step toward her. The cabin seemed to close in, the walls groaning and the air thick with a suffocating pressure. "This ends now," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. The reflection's grin twisted into something darker, more menacing. "Does it?" it asked, tilting its head. "You don't even know what you're fighting. You're not ready for the truth." "I don't care," Sarah shouted, lifting the axe above her head. "I won't let you take me." With a scream, she swung the axe, aiming directly at the reflection's chest. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The blade made contact, but instead of striking flesh, it passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. The reflection laughed, a cold, piercing sound that reverberated through the cabin. "Is that all you've got?" it taunted. But then something changed. The axe, now embedded in the floor, sent a shock wave through the room. The mirror behind the reflection cracked violently, shards of glass flying outward as a deafening roar filled the air. The reflection staggered, its form flickering like a dying flame. "No!" it screamed, its voice layered and distorted. "You can't." Before it could finish, the mirror shattered completely, releasing a blinding light that engulfed the room. Sarah shielded her eyes, the heat and energy overwhelming her senses. And then silence. When she opened her eyes, the cabin was gone. She was standing in the forest, the morning sun shining brightly through the trees. The oppressive darkness, the twisted branches, all of it was gone. She fell to her knees, the axe slipping from her hands as tears streamed down her face. The air was fresh and cool, filling her lungs with a relief she hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. But as she sat there, a faint sound reached her ears, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Sarah." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the forest. There in the distance, barely visible through the trees, stood a figure. It was her reflection, watching her with that same twisted smile. It didn't move. It didn't speak again. It just stood there, a shadow in the light. Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to take a deep breath. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. But she knew it wasn't over. It would never truly be over, because you can't escape yourself.